There you go. Good to be with you, my friends. So we're going to continue in our fun here today with the 4th chapter of Genesis. Well, let's see. There it goes. Well, not quite immediately. So last time we looked at, this was 2 weeks ago, we went through the second creation story, the one with, not 7 distinct days. This was the one with Adam and Eve, right? Mm-hmm. So then the expulsion as they eat the forbidden fruit. So now we're going to look at life after Eden as we get out. And this is really more the story of Cain and Abel. So just jumping straight into the readings. The human knew Hava, his wife, Eve, as we translate it, right? She became pregnant and bore Cain. And she said, Cainiti, I have gotten a man, as has Yahweh, or the Lord. She continued bearing his brother Hevel, or Abel. Now Hevel became a shepherd of flocks, and Cain became a worker of the soil. It was after the passing of days that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil a gift to the Lord. And as for Hevel, he too brought from the firstborn of his flock from their fat parts. The Lord had regard for Hevel and his gift. For Cain and his gift he had no regard. Cain became exceedingly upset, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you so upset? Why has your face fallen? Is it not thus? If you intend good, bear it aloft. But if you do not intend good, at the entrance is sin, a crouching demon, towards you his lust, but you can rule over him. Cain said to Hevel his brother, let us go out to the field. But then it was, when they were out in the field, that Cain rose up against Hevel his brother, and he killed him. The Lord said to Cain, where is Hevel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I the watcher of my brother? Now he said, what have you done? A sound. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And now damned be you from the soil, which opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you wish to work the soil, it will not henceforth give you its strength, will give its strength to you. Wavering and wandering must you be on earth. Cain said to the Lord, my iniquity is too great to be borne. Here, you drive me away today from the face of the soil, and from your face must I conceal myself. I must be wavering and wandering on earth. Now it will be that whoever comes upon me will kill me. The Lord said to him, no, therefore whoever kills Cain, sevenfold will it be avenged. So the Lord set a sign for Cain, so that whoever came upon him would not strike him down. Cain went out from the face of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, or wandering, east of Eden. All right, so today we have the story of Cain, or Cain, and Abel, Hevel. Brueggemann likes to talk about this as a sort of parable of humanity. In fact, most do. It is not typical that people really believe this is a literal event, because after all, we have stuff that already gets confusing in the same way that it does for the story of Adam and Eve. If we think it was just 2 people and not really a sort of story of how humanity comes to be, then when Cain says someone else is going to kill me, the likely answer should be, who is going to kill you? There's no one else here, right? If it's just the literal Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, there aren't any other women and there aren't any other people. So we should understand it more as a little bit of a parable or a story to understand creation and humanity, right? So he understands the creation story with Adam and Eve as a story about how humanity deals with God, right? That's what Brueggemann talks about that story as. This is how humanity deals with God. On the other hand, this is a story about how we deal with our brothers and sisters, not in the biologically related sense as much as all of humanity's sense, our common humans, right? So with that in mind, he then starts to point out Cain, or Cain, means to create, to get. And thus you have this idea of Cain as full of life. As Eve says, I have created, I have gotten a man, right? I've gotten a boy. And so she names him Cain after that. On the other end, Abel, Hevel means vapor, nothingness. I love Hebrew. It does this all the time, right? I wonder which one's going to make it.
Yeah.
You don't even have to go into the story and go, one is called created and getting, and the other one's called nothingness. All right. It's sort of like at the beginning of the story of Ruth. The sons of Naomi are named Mahlon and Chilion, which means diseased and dying. So we shouldn't be surprised that about 2 verses later, they both die. But anyway, so the problem in this story comes from God. On this, I can definitely agree with Brueggemann, if nothing else, right? Why? Here's the answer. Real question is, why does God prefer the offering of one son over the other? Why does he prefer Hevel, Abel's offering over Cain's offering, right? Some will say it's sort of that cowboys versus farmers. Oh, one is a shepherd, the other is a farmer, but literally nothing in the text says why God decides to prefer one to the other. There's been lots of preaching and commentary that says God prefers shepherds over farmers, or cowboys and ranchers over farmers and planters. It's just not in the text. The only thing we know is that God prefers Hevel's offering, but he doesn't say why he prefers. Nowhere does it say why. That's all human interpretation on top of it. We're just stuck with this reality that God prefers the offering of one over the other, right? And as Brueggemann says, it is all about the capricious freedom of the Lord, right? That's the reality of God. God can like somebody more than God likes somebody else, and just sort of stuck with it. Why does God love Abraham, right? Why does God love Abel? Why does God prefer Jacob over Esau? It's just the capricious freedom of God. God gets to choose what God chooses. And here's the reality then, because of his preference, God sets into motion all the problems by choosing to favor one person over another. And yes, we should say that it's not fair. And maybe we could say we don't understand God, but it's still the reality that it's all set into motion by God. And again, I'm not getting into deep theological ideas here as much as this is just how the story goes, right? The story goes that God preferred one over the other, and it created a conflict. That's all the information we have in the story itself, right? The same is true for Joseph and his brothers. The same is true for Esau and Jacob. Go down a very long list, right? God makes these preferences and chooses to like somebody more than the other, and it becomes a problem. How people deal with that, right? And there's a larger quote here from Brueggemann that explains his idea a little better, which I think is helpful. Life is not a garden party, but a harsh fellowship among watchful siblings, made harsher by the heavy ways of God. All through the Genesis narratives, the Lord is there to disrupt, to create tensions, and to evoke the shadowy side of reality. Here, the interpreter may pause to acknowledge that our lives are filled with disruptions, tensions, and shadows. And we must either credit the abrasion to God, as does this story, or offer an alternative account. Offer an alternative account. Either way, it causes our faith to fall. Pretty challenging quote, right? Why is it a challenging quote? Well, it does something that Christians reflexively reject, which is we want to say that God is good, not that God can provoke and tempt and cause trouble. That's not the way we want to think about God. We want to say God is fair, God is just, God is right, God is omnipotent and all-loving, right? Not God makes arbitrary choices, or at least arbitrary to us, right? We want to say that God's perfect and fair. But this is the reality of what it means to be a monotheist, right? If we believe that there is only one God, then you can't have an opposing evil God. Blame the devil. You have to deal with the fact that God can like some group more than us, right? That's why sometimes I do think the prosperity gospel has become such a big deal, because people don't like the idea that God prefers the poor. It doesn't necessarily mean he rejects the rich. It just means he has a preference. But some of that prosperity gospel, I think, is an attempt to say, well, no, God likes us too. Right? So this is a big one. Thoughts, because Brueggemann's stirring it up right out the gate. Right out the gate, he's stirring it up. But it's what we have with the story, right? This is the tension in the story comes from God. Brueggemann literally at one point says this family might well have been better off without the Lord involved, because it's all from God that this whole conflict comes, right? At least as far as the offerings, and then his preference for one over the other. What do y'all think about that assessment from Brueggemann that God's stirring it up?
He's just stirring it up in the stories, Bill. Okay. We have to remember when this was written. Okay. The whole Old Testament is actually a growth in the belief of who and what God is. Okay. And in the beginning, I think what the writers are trying to do, it's really how they're trying to explain humanity.
Sure.
Okay. And yeah. And there is no devil. You're absolutely right, but there is good and evil. So God must be stirring both of those pots, right? Okay. Yep. But I just, yeah, because I can't accept it. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I just can't do it. Okay. Sure. As folks who know me well from my EFM days, okay, this is not my God. Okay, yeah. But there you go.
Yeah.
I am shocked that Stefan can't do this, but
thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that we have to consider when this was written, as Stefan said, and yeah, I just see this as, humanity trying to, in this constant struggle to be in relationship with God, and to sort of, in a crude way, figure out what God is about, although still acknowledging that they never really can figure it out. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that, not until after Genesis was written, probably up until around the time Job was written, do we really get writers saying, sort of questioning this notion that if things are bad, it's because I did something bad and I'm being punished. And if things are good, it's because I did something good and I'm being rewarded. And so, that people are the world view is that things are the way they are because for some reason, God did it this way. And it seems to me that, when we get to Jesus, we get to the point of Jesus saying, you're not being punished for the sins of your parents. Anyway, that's how I look at it.
Sure.
I think maybe in the second bullet point where they're talking about we want God to be good as opposed to a God that can cause trouble, mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure God's both. And I'm pretty sure he stirs up trouble toward the end of good.
Well, that reminds me of a sermon I had heard one time, preaching on the passage that the Son of Man will come like a thief in the night. It's saying, that may not be the the most pleasant notion to contemplate, but sometimes that's how we encounter God. It's not what we were looking for.
Well, I do think, and we can attribute to God or not, but there are certain those times in the world when, if we enter into the text a little bit, right, where we say, hey, I know two people who gave everything they could to the church, and, one person left the church and, went back home and their business thrived and everything went well. And the other one, their whole world fell apart and all kinds of bad things happened. But ostensibly, they're both good Christians. They're both good people. They're both good Jews. It doesn't matter, right? Which would be sort of a retelling of this story where I do think we have to sort of wrestle with, well, but why? Like, I guess certainly our worship is independent of what happens in the world all the time. It's just that one side is willing to say God's involved in each of those, right? It's not just that God gives the blessing to the one person who gives an offering and then causes trouble for the other. But there is that sort of undercurrent that we always wrestle with. Why do bad things happen to good people? And is that part of God's action in the world, or is it I certainly don't believe it's punishment for our action or inaction in the world, but it is still that sort of theodicy question, which is the technical term for that, of, well, what do we do with these kinds of things? And it's bold on one level, even if it is the earliest part of the story, to have someone say, well, I'm willing to say that God's part of that. And again, there's no blame on Abel or Cain for it's just that God makes a preference, right? God sort of goes, I like this guy better. I'm going to give him a little bit more.
Then I have a hard time deciding, well, where's the line drawn? If God stirs things up for trouble, for good in the end, where do you draw the line between just throwing down a gauntlet and, somebody's child dying, or any of the horrible, terrible things that happen in the world? So where's the cutoff?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is no easy cutoff, is there? There's,
and even like all the teachers and the children that were recently killed, and some people were saying, well, God was with the ones that were not killed, and that drives me crazy, because it's like, I just think it's also evil, and you I think God may get blamed for a lot of stuff that God did not want to happen.
yeah.
I can't believe that God wanted the children and the teachers who died to die. I know it, and then it comes into your head, well, if he's all powerful, why didn't he do something? There's not a good answer for that.
Yeah.
The only thing that brings me comfort, and it's kind of, sometimes I think I take this cop out a little too soon before I really chew on things sufficiently. But what I keep reminding myself, and the only thing that comforts me, is that we're never gonna get God.
Sure.
Too big, too much. Our brains are limited, our language is limited, our experience is limited. It's we say that surpasses all understanding for a reason.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The modern version of this, and there is a modern version and relation to this sort of whole question about where God is in this process. The Lord's Prayer famously says, lead us not into temptation. We're addressing God. We're saying, God, tempt us, don't lead us into temptation. And the Pope and some theologians were so bothered by the idea that God could even possibly lead us into temptation, they changed it so that instead it's supposed to say, do not let us be led into temptation by like other forces, by deep demonic evil forces, right? They wanted it out of God's hands and in the hands of another person, deity issue, right? So even though Jesus said it, it still becomes problematic for a lot of people, enough for the Pope literally wanted to change the words for it.
Mhm. True.
And we're not going to come up with an answer, but it is just to say that that's how it goes. All right, so we'll continue with Brueggemann here a little bit more. So we then have God's odd speech to Cain, right? Like God clearly notices that Cain is upset, and responds to him with this odd little speech. Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. All right, so in this case, sin is not a person. We don't have like the devil lusts after you, but it does have a certain force, right? I mean, there's something other about it, that it can desire us, that it can lust after us, as the Schocken translation, which actually the word is lust. It's the same word that's used for when the punishment to Eve, right? You will lust after your husband. It's the same kind of terminology. It's the same word in Hebrew, that is. So we can say that sin has a certain energy, a force, a presence that is separate from both Cain and from God. So when we talk about good and evil, sin/evil certainly seems to be other than God, right, in this situation. So we're somewhere between God, how God does it, and how the devil does it, right? We're somewhere between those two extremes. God didn't force Cain to do anything, and the devil doesn't force Cain to do anything, but there seems to be some opposition there, or some options at play. All that said, so I'm going to shift a little bit. John Steinbeck, his crowning achievement, what he considered his greatest book and is often considered his greatest work, was East of Eden. Not a lot of people have read it. It's one that everybody used to read, but not so much anymore. But in that work, the whole book is literally, he retells the story of Adam with a character called Adam Trask. It's not real hidden. His sons are Aaron and Cal, not too far from Cain and Abel. And then Adam makes the choice, just like his namesake, of favoring Aaron, right? Although Steinbeck takes it out of God's hands and puts it in Adam's hands, right? For he favors one son over the other and creates all these sort of problems by doing that. And the damage that Adam creates in the family by favoring one child over the other is huge. It causes all kinds of problems, you can imagine. Finally, his friend Lee, who actually is a Chinese immigrant who basically cooks and cleans for the Trask family and helps raise Aaron and Cal, helps him see the error in his ways through a reflection on these very verses, literally this verse. And so the whole next quote comes directly from Steinbeck's novel. I'm going to read it to you. It is clearly a product of its time. It was written in the 30s or maybe 40s, where there's more than a little bit of commentary that is anti-Asian and a little sloppy, but it's all right. It's not all right, but it's from the season that it was written in, right? But it's brilliantly written just to help us understand the importance of that one sentence, right? Of the sentence that God speaks to Cain. Lee said, do you remember when you read us the 16 verses of the 4th chapter of Genesis and we argued about them? Samuel, a friend of the family and he's a sort of father figure to Adam, because Adam has a bad relationship with his dad, says, I do indeed, and that's a long time ago. 10 years nearly, said Lee. Well, the story bit deeply into me, and I went into it word for word. The more I thought about the story, the more profound it became to me. Then I compared the translations we have, and they were fairly close. There was only one place that bothered me. The King James Version says this: it is when Jehovah has asked Cain why he is angry. And Jehovah says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. It was the thou shalt that struck me, because it was a promise that Cain would conquer sin. Samuel nodded, and his children didn't do it entirely, he said. Lee sipped his coffee. Then I got a copy of the American Standard Bible. It was very new then, and it was different in this passage. It says, do thou rule over him. Now, this is very different. This is not a promise. It is an order. And I began to stew about it. I wondered what the original word of the original writer had been, that these very different translations could be made. Samuel put his palms down on the table, leaned forward, and the old young light came into his eyes. Lee, he said, don't tell me you studied Hebrew. Lee said, I'm going to tell you. It's a fairly long story. Will you have a touch of Ning Kai Pai? You mean the drink that tastes of rotten apples? It tastes good of rotten apples? Yes, I can talk better with it. Maybe I can listen better, said Samuel. While Lee went to the kitchen, Samuel asked Adam, did you know about this? No, said Adam. He didn't tell me. Maybe I wasn't listening. Lee came back with his stone bottle and 3 little porcelain cups, so thin and delicate that the light shone through them. Delicately Chinese fashion, he said, and poured that almost black liquor. There's a lot of wormwood in this. It's quite a drink, he said. Has about the same effect as absinthe if you drink enough of it. Samuel sipped the drink. I want to know why you were so interested, he said. Well, it seemed to me that the man who could conceive this great story would know exactly what he wanted to say, and there would be no confusion in his statements. You say the man. Do you then think this is not a divine? Do you then not think this is a divine book written by the inky finger of God? I think the mind that could think this story was a curiously divine mind. We have had such a few minds in China too. I wanted to know, said Samuel. You're not a Presbyterian after all. I told you I was getting more Chinese. Well, to go on, I went to San Francisco to the headquarters of our family association. Do you know about them? Our great families have centers where any member can get help or give it. The Lee family is very large. It takes care of its own. I have heard of them, said Samuel. And then I'm going to skip that line, but I guess so. It's a little different from that, really, said Lee. I went there because in our family, there are a number of ancient reverend gentlemen who are great scholars. They are thinkers in exactness. A man may spend many years pondering a sentence of the scholar you call Confucius. I thought there might be experts in meaning who could advise him. And by the way, this is accurate. Many of the Chinese families, as they immigrated to the U.S., had family associations that would support their family and help their family in the new world, both as soon as they got off the boat, help them find a place to live, and then also help them grow their business and thrive. So it was a little bit of that, but it was also sort of centers of Chinese thinking to preserve the Chinese way as they came into an alien culture, into the American culture, right? So there is historic truth to these organizations. They are fine old men. They smoke their 2 pipes of opium in the afternoon, and it rests and sharpens them. And they sit through the night, and their minds are wonderful. I guess no other people have been able to use opium well. Lee dampened his tongue in the black brew. I respectfully submitted my problem to one of these sages, read him the story, and told him what I understood from it. The next night, 4 of them met and called me in. We discussed the story all night long. Lee laughed. I guess it's funny, he said. I know I wouldn't dare tell it to many people. Can you imagine 4 old gentlemen, the youngest is over 90 now, taking on the study of Hebrew? They engaged a learned rabbi. They took to the study as though they were children. Exercise books, grammar, vocabulary, simple sentences. You should see Hebrew written in Chinese ink with a brush. The right to left didn't bother them as much as it would you, since we write up to down. Oh, they were perfectionists. They went to the root of the matter. And you, said Samuel? I went along with them, marveling at the beauty of their proud, clean brains. I began to love my race, and for the first time, I wanted to be Chinese. Every 2 weeks, I went to a meeting with them, and in my room here, I covered pages with writing. I bought every known Hebrew dictionary, but the old gentlemen were always ahead of me. It wasn't long before they were ahead of our rabbi. He brought in a colleague. Mr. Hamilton, you should have sat through some of these nights of argument and discussion, the questions, the inspection, oh, the lovely thinking, the beautiful thinking. After 2 years, we felt that we could approach your 16 verses of the 4th chapter of Genesis. My old gentleman felt that these words were very important too. Thou shalt and do thou. And this was the gold from our mining. Thou mayest rule over sin. The old gentleman smiled and nodded and felt the years were well spent. And it brought them out of their Chinese shells too. And right now they're studying Greek. Samuel said, well, it's a fantastic story, and I've tried to follow, and maybe I've missed somewhere. Why is this word so important? Lee's hand shook as he filled delicate cups. He drank his down in one gulp. Don't you see, he cried. The American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin, and you can call sin ignorance. The King James translation makes a promise in thou shalt, meaning that men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the word timshel, thou mayest, that gives a choice. It might be the most important word in the world. That says the way is open. That throws it right back on man. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not. Don't you see? Yes, I see, I do see, but you do not believe this is divine law. Why do you feel its importance? Ah, said Lee, I've wanted to tell you this for a long time. I even anticipated your questions, and I am well prepared. And any writing which has influenced the thinking and lives of innumerable people is important. Now, there are many millions in their sects and churches who feel the order, do thou, and throw their weight into obedience. And there are millions more who feel predestination and thou shalt. Nothing they may do can interfere with what will be. But thou mayest? Why, that makes a man great. That gives him stature with the gods, for in his weakness and his filth and his murder of his brother, he is still the great choice. He can choose his course and fight it through and win. Lee's voice was a chant of triumph. Adam said, do you believe that, Lee? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. It is easy out of laziness, out of weakness, to throw oneself into the lap of deity, saying, I couldn't help it. The way was set. But think of the glory of the choice. That makes a man a man. A cat has no choice. A bee must make honey. There's no godliness there. And do you know, those old gentlemen who were sliding gently down to death are now too interested to die? Adam said, do you mean these Chinese men believe the Old Testament? Lee said, these old men believe a true story. They know a true story when they hear it. They are critics of truth. They know that these 16 verses are a history of humankind in any age or culture or race. They do not believe a man writes 15 3/4 verses of truth and tells a lie with one verb. Confucius tells men how they should live to have good and successful lives. But this is a ladder to climb to the stars. Lee's eyes shone. You can never lose that. It cuts the feet from under weakness and cowardliness and laziness. Adam said, I don't see how you could cook and raise the boys and take care of me and still do all of this. Neither do I, said Lee, but I take my 2 pipes in the afternoon, no more and no less, like the elders. I feel like that I am a man. I feel that a man is a very important thing, maybe more important than a star, and this is not theology. I have no bent toward gods, but I have a new love for that glittering instrument, the human soul. It's a lovely and unique thing in the universe. It is always attacked and never destroyed because thou mayest. All right. I read you a lot of Steinbeck there. But so Steinbeck shares the importance of this verse so profoundly that Brueggemann literally quotes it at length in his commentary. And it's in another commentary I had with, which one was that? The New Interpreter's Bible commentary. Both all feel that Tim Shell, perhaps because Steinbeck wrote it, or because he just wrote it so well, it matters, right? That one little word can make all the difference for us understanding some of this. That God effectively challenges Cain to say, you can choose life or death, but it's up to you, right? It's the epitome of free will in the middle of this little phrase. I just read you a huge section with a really big thought all wrapped up in it. Thoughts on Tim Shell on this idea that we may overcome sin, but not that we have to, or that we are destined to.
Wow.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Wow. All I can do is say, I mean, I read that years ago, but never really understood it like I do today. Okay. I've always liked Steinbeck. I've always thought he's one of the greatest American authors, but okay. That was pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And I also agree. The problem is there's no, when you say thoughts, it's like it's beautiful. I mean, it says it all, right? That you may, okay, thou mayest, you may. It's just, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. It also speaks to me. I love this when I read it years ago, gosh, 20 years ago. But I also loved it because it shows the importance of translation, right? Like one little word in a translation can make a monumental difference if you're paying attention to the words.
Stunning difference can be made by one word.
Lynn, how does the messenger address it? Is Lynn there?
He was.
Yeah.
I muted for a while. I'm sorry, I don't have the message with me today. I could run and get it, but
no, that's okay.
I've got it here.
Okay.
That verse says, I just had to find it. God spoke to Cain, why this tantrum? Why the sulking? If you do well, won't you be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin is lying in wait for you, ready to pounce. It's out to get you. You've got to master it.
Okay. It's the command. It's the command. You have to master it.
I don't
right?
interpret it that way. I mean, I think it's more of a challenge.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I still think you may is a lot more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Steinbeck may have colored it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's a choice you've got to make. It's up to you. Whereas the message would be more like telling you what you need to choose.
Right.
It seems to me that it begs the question, what happens if you don't master it?
Right. If thou mayest not, right? Yeah.
Or if it says you must, but what happens if you don't?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like like having adult children. I mean, there are times that you just have to lay it out and let them make a choice and understand that sometimes from your perspective, they're going to make the wrong choice, but you got to let them make it.
Yep. All right. Well, so there's another way to look at it. So we've looked at two ways of engaging the text. Brueggemann declares that Adam and Eve is about our vertical relationship, that is our vertical relationship with God. And then his interpretation of all of this basically says that between Cain and Abel is our horizontal relationship, our relationship with our fellow human, right? He uses the term, it's how brothers relate, but he really means it much more generically than that, which is just, this is sort of how do we deal with each other? That's Brueggemann's understanding of this text. And I agree with it largely. I don't have any disagreement there at all. I think this is about how do we deal and treat each other is a big part of this conversation. not just about the first murder and punishment or those kinds of things, as much as it's really trying to help us understand ways that we are going to have to deal with each other throughout the whole rest of the book, right? I mean, the whole rest of the book, New and Old Testament alike, are wrapped up with how do we deal with God, and then how do we deal with each other, right? There is another way that I just wanted to bring up just to throw more chum in the water and see what y'all think. It's from a guy by the name Renee Girard. I wrote my thesis on him for my doctoral program, who has a similar but different way of looking at it. So just a quick background, Girard's a literary critic. He started out as a literary critic who first looked at the stories of the Greek pantheon of gods and wrote a book called Violence in the Sacred, right? And he noticed basically, as the title might suggest, that there's a great deal of connection between violence and religion, violence and worship. And not in terms of like, oh, if you worship the gods, you're more inclined to start a war or kill someone else. Nothing like that. It's much more just within the stories themselves. There's a great deal about sacrifice, right? There's a great deal about killing something or someone, an animal or a person, for the gods, and those kinds of things. So it's still literally, I had one of my youth group kids became a PhD in classic studies. And when he found out I was reading Girard, we started comparing notes, because it's still considered one of the most important books for classical studies in the last 50 years, because of the way he takes apart and views those stories, all those legends of, Zeus and the pantheon of gods. But what he noticed in that was obviously a deep connection between violence and faith, sacrifice and holy, destruction and life, that these are all really deeply connected things. And usually it's almost as though religion demands sacrifice, right? And so he wrote this book in 1972, or maybe 73, something like that. And then someone said, hey, you should do the same thing with Christianity. Why don't you look at Christianity? And through studying the scriptures, he instantly became a Christian. He was not a Christian before that. He was baptized and became a devout Catholic for the rest of his life, attending church often every day, because he felt it was so important. The stories were so different. And that was typically, you had in the stories of the gods, you would have these moments of an innocent victim being sacrificed, often a scapegoat, right? Somebody would be pointed out as, oh, well, this person's other, let's kill them, to make the gods happy. And he said Christianity and Judaism were the first book that he read that declared the innocence of the scapegoat, right? That began to say, wait a second, just because you are, and we could modernize it and say, just because you're gay doesn't mean you're worthy of death. They're innocent of what you're fighting about on this other issues and things, right? Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you deserve death. It's because you're fighting about other things and you're casting all your anger on something else, scapegoat, right? And for Girard, this was the critical thing to say, this is why Christianity is so important for the world, is it's the only one that can say, vengeance has to end, and instead we have to figure out a way to love and work together. Does that make sense? I just gave you literally one of the more complex theological concepts out there for Girard. I'm trying to make it super simple, maybe oversimplifying, but that's the general idea. But what he starts with is he understands that humanity is a deeply social animal, and that our first instinct, the one thing we come out of the womb with, is imitation, right? Like if a dolphin is born, it instantly knows how to swim. If a giraffe or a deer is born, it might stumble around for a few minutes, but it can pretty much run by the first afternoon. Humanity can't do any of those. All we can do is imitate our parents and each other, right? So he called this learning from each other, sharing our desires, mimesis, or mimetic, from the word mimic rather, where we copy others. He calls it mimetic desire. Everything that we know and we think we know comes because we see somebody else that likes something, so we go, oh, well, that must be something we should all like. Here's Girard's brilliant critique of humanity. The result is, if we are, as humans, social animals, and that our main instinct is imitation, that means that there is literally nothing in the width and breadth of human experience that is not a borrowed desire from someone else, right? This is why advertising works on us. If we see a famous person that says, I love the iPhone, then we go, well, then I should get an iPhone, because we mimic each other, right? Oh, if that person's cool or neat or great, then I'm going to do it. Why advertising works on us. It's why, there's really no arbitrary objective reason why a Ferrari is a nicer car than a Honda Accord. It has a different look, but ultimately it still just gets you from one place to another. But people have said that this is why this is a much more nice and important car. And so we all go, well, then, yeah, it's a nice and important car, right? That's how we share our desires, we imitate each other. And so if everybody says a Cadillac's the nicest car to drive, then everybody goes, well, yeah, Cadillac's the nicest car to drive. Very few people say, wait a second, is it? And usually they're pointed at and, what are you talking about? Of course it's a great car. And everybody yells at him and tries to stop him, right? That's his whole understanding of humanity, is this mimetic animal who borrows our desires from others. All of that to say, when he reads this story, then he sees this story as the founding of community, which is caught up in sin. That is, where does Cain go after he kills his brother? Into the city. He goes into community. The founding story is all about how when people deal with each other, they have to mediate their desires with each other. And the only way to do that is with other people. You go to a city to figure out what your limits are. Because if you're just by yourself out in the woods, you can do anything you want, right? But you have to go into the city, into relationship, into this community to deal with shared desires, shared hopes, shared dreams. And not everybody can be president. Not everybody can be the movie star. Not everybody can be the smartest person in the room, because after all, there can only be one smartest person in the room, right? So he's not saying that all humanity is evil or that living in community is evil. But what he is saying is that we must choose carefully who we choose to mimic, right? This is his understanding. Cain chooses to mimic sin. Cain chooses to mimic this sort of desire to be the best. And if that means getting rid of your competition, then you get rid of your competition. He basically is saying, we tend to be violent if we just mimic other humans. We tend to go with some of the worst elements, right? Violent, conflictual, broken, disruptive. It lends to sin and brokenness and death. His critique is to say we need to focus on mimicking God, whose desires are to love and care and willingly give for each other, right? For Girard, this is not a literal story, it's a figurative story where this whole system is set up for the rest of the book. Who are we going to mimic? Man and man's desires, where we borrow, like, oh, we all decide that this person's pretty, we all decide that that person's handsome? Or are we going to just mimic God, who says, I've created them all and they're all my children, right? Which one do we mimic? Who do we intentionally think and follow, is Girard's critique. And so in his understanding, then, this whole story is about how do we live with each other. In that regard, it's like Brueggemann, right? The story is about how do we establish working with each other as humanity. But even more, it becomes a question of, as we go into that relationship, who are we intentionally trying to work with? Is it with God, or is it purely with each other? Because if it's with each other, we're going to end up in a situation where violence and conflict are most inevitable. But if we go into it with the ideas that God has, which is, wait, these are my beloved sisters and brothers, not someone that I have to fight with to get something, but I can work with, then it's a different model. Haha. All right. Woo. Girard, he's tough. And I've given you 5 minutes to respond. Any thoughts on Girard? He's a tough one to unpack, and we could probably spend another whole class just engaging Girard on this, but just wanted to give you a different way of looking at it than purely the sort of foundational murder that it sometimes gets simplified as.
You ran your mother off.
What's that?
You ran your mother off.
I know, my mom was done. She's done with that story.
No, that's good stuff. That's good head scratchers.
It reminds me of that passage in the synoptics where Jesus was going to heal somebody, or someone, encountered Jesus seeking healing and says, in essence, if you choose, you can make me well. And
Right.
Jesus says, I do choose. You're healed.
Yeah.
So you have the choice to choose the path of healing or not.
Yeah. And I guess in that regard, it is similar. Girard is in many ways sort of making the same statement that was made in the whole quote, about Tim Shell, right? It's the same kind of idea of thou mayest, right? We can choose to follow God, or we can choose to follow humanity, but one is going to lead to sort of what Roy's question is, like, what if thou mayest not, or what if you must, if you don't, then not Brueggemann, but Girard would certainly say, well, then that's the way of death, right? That it's ultimately going to lead to conflict and misery and hurt. The way of God's going to not necessarily insulate you from those problems, but at least you're headed in the right direction.
I.e., who are you going to mimic, right? Okay.
Who you're going to mimic, yeah.
Mhm.
And then, so Girard, when you get to the New Testament, that's where Girard understands Jesus's entire life, not just the crucifixion, but Jesus's entire life becomes important, because everything that Jesus does is to follow God, and therefore when he's teaching is just as important as when he's crucified, right? Like, all of it matters in Girard's thinking in a way that it doesn't for a lot of other thinkers of the Christian faith. They'll say, well, what really matters is that he died for our sins. And Girard goes, no, he's showing you how to be a better person all the way through the book. You're missing the whole story, right? Don't just think it's just about the crucifixion and resurrection, but it's also about how he treats the woman at the well. It's how he treats the woman who asks to be healed, right? I mean, it's all of this that matters, not just the one final story. I'm a Girard fan, in case you can't tell.
Mhm.
For that reason. For that
Kind of
reason.
pick that up.
But it's for that reason. I mean, I think it's so much more life-giving to know that the Sermon on the Mount is just important as any other part of the story, right? Like, if all of that matters, then it's a whole different way of viewing the Gospels than just just focus on the last chapter or two. You'll learn the main stuff, right? Just on the violence and the death.
Well,
All right,
we just did the Gospel of Mark,
Mhm.
and I mean, sort of, my take from the Gospel of Mark was the kingdom of God is found in giving yourself away, in self-emptying love, and that's the whole, and that's what the whole is being illustrated by the life, and that it culminates in the ultimate giving of self.
Absolutely. But just to finish out the story, because there is sort of questions about this, there is the famous mark of Cain. God declares Cain guilty of murder and then protects Cain from being murdered, right? He puts this mark on him where no one will kill him because he killed someone else, right? This idea of sort of preventative vengeance. Brueggemann weighs in on this. It's a great quote that I just want to share. So the killer, Cain, has no resources of his own, but must cast himself upon the mercy of the life giver, God. In such a mercy, a mark asserting both guilt and grace. In such a simple way, the narrative articulates the two-sidedness of human life. In jeopardy for disobedience, and yet kept safe. Right? Because there's always this conversation about what is the mark of Cain. We don't know. We don't know if it was a tattoo or if he had a sign over his head that flashed or what it was. But the import of the sign is what matters. And it is that sort of, here is somebody who broke the rules and someone who's under God's protection at the same time. So next week, we'll look at those stories between Cain and Abel and the flood, and what those folks did to make God so awful mad to flood the world anyway, right? So we'll do that next Thursday. Any other thoughts? I probably poured a little too much in on that one, but it's a good story.
No,
It was good, Bill. Enjoyed it.
That's great.
it's going to have my brain working for a while, and that's a dangerous thing, Bill. But
Well, I
okay.
know that. You'll come up and ask me questions on Sunday, and I'll have to remember what the heck I said.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and I love how you did a drive-by stirring up of the whole capital punishment conversation in the last 37 seconds of this call.
Well, that too, yes. Then there's that. Well, and this is, I mean, I do love, this is also, I love Genesis because every story has about 20 venues that you can jump in on with it. I mean, all of it. The whole book is like this. So we could spend probably, like, as Lee does with his Chinese friends studying the book, right? You could spend 2 years on probably a couple of passages quite easily and say, that was time well spent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good to be with you, my friends. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you,
You
Bill.
too, Bill.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Bill.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Everyone,
Take
take care.